You don't feel the bite. That's the part people never believe. An insect the size of a thumbnail climbs onto your face while you sleep, feeds on you for up to 20 minutes. 20 minutes! Longer than most first dates, and you don't wake up. It has a mouth part built like a hypodermic needle and saliva laced with its own local anesthetic. Evolution built you a burglar that tips the security guard. Then, almost as an afterthought, it defecates next to the bite wound. And that's the part that matters, because you, half asleep, do exactly what every primate nervous system has been trained to do for 60 million years when something itches. You scratch it, you rub the bite, you grind the parasite-laden feces directly into your own bloodstream with your own fingernail. Congratulations, you just did the parasite's job for it. I'm going to tell you about a disease that may have shaped one of the most important scientific theories in human history, quietly, invisibly, for 40 years inside the body of a man who never got a diagnosis while he was alive. And I want to be upfront with you before we start. This is a mystery, not a solved case, a mystery with a very compelling suspect, a mountain of circumstantial evidence, and a defense attorney's worth of doubt. I'll flag exactly which parts are fact and which parts are educated guessing, because that distinction is the whole point of medicine, and frankly, it's the only part of this story I take seriously. Everything else we're allowed to have fun with. In 1831, a 22-year-old with mediocre grades and a passionate interest in beetles boarded a ship called HMS Beagle. He was, by every account, robust. He hiked mountains, he rode horses across the pampas for days at a stretch. He once wrote about wading through freezing water to collect specimens like it was a minor inconvenience. This is not a man who spends much time thinking about his own body. This is a man who thinks about everyone else's body. Snails, finches, barnacles, worms, anything except his own. That matters, because somewhere on this 5-year voyage, something changed. By his early 30s, Charles Darwin, yes, that Darwin, became one of history's most famous invalids. Decades of vomiting, crushing fatigue that could flatten him for days, skin eruptions, trembling, a digestive system that seemed to declare war on him roughly every afternoon for the rest of his working life. He tried everything the 19th century had to offer, which, full disclosure, was not much. Cold water therapy, electric shock belts, a regimen that basically amounted to sit very still and hope. None of it worked for long. He spent the final 4 decades of his life managing a body that had quietly, mysteriously turned against him, all while producing some of the most important scientific writing in human history from what was essentially a sickbed with excellent penmanship. For 150 years, people have argued about what was wrong with him. Anxiety, arsenic poisoning from his own experimental treatments, a rare genetic disorder, lactose intolerance, which I promise you does not explain 40 years of progressive cardiac symptoms. But there's one hypothesis that has outlasted almost all the others, because it doesn't just explain the symptoms, it explains the timeline. And the timeline starts on a single night in South America with an insect that has one of the best entrances in all of parasitology. March 26, 1835. Darwin is in Argentina, in a small town called Luján, and he writes something in his diary that reads almost like a horror-adjacent nature note. He describes a large black bug. He calls it the binchuca, a local name for what we now know as Trypanosoma infestans, which is one of the great false advertising jobs in the animal kingdom because there is nothing romantic happening here. It's called that because it prefers to bite around the mouth and eyes, where the skin is thin and blood vessels sit close to the surface. It is, essentially, an assassin with excellent bedside manner. Darwin, being Darwin, watched the entire thing happen and then wrote about how interesting it was. That single diary entry, one bug, one bite, one curious naturalist who refused to stop observing things even while they were actively feeding on him, is the seed of the entire hypothesis you're about to hear. Because that bug is the primary vector for one of the most quietly devastating infections in the Western Hemisphere, Chagas disease, caused by a single-celled parasite called Trypanosoma cruzi. Known fact, Darwin really did write this diary entry. Known fact, Trypanosoma infestans is endemic to the exact region he was traveling through. Hypothesis, not fact, that this bite is what caused his lifelong illness. We'll come back to why that distinction matters enormously. But first, let's talk about what this parasite actually does, because it is one of the strangest home invasions in all of biology. T. cruzi doesn't live in the bug's mouth like a mosquito's malaria parasite does. It lives in the gut, which means the insect isn't injecting the parasite when it bites you. It's the opposite. It bites, it feeds, and then, mid-meal or shortly after, it poops. The feces are loaded with infectious parasites in a form called trypanosomes, tiny whip-tailed cells built for one purpose, which is finding a way into your bloodstream. They can't swim through intact skin. They need a doorway, and your itch reflex builds one every single time. Once inside, the parasite does something most pathogens don't bother with. It goes indoors. It invades your own cells. Heart muscle cells and smooth muscle cells are particular favorites. And once inside, it sheds its outer coat and transforms into a rounder form called an amastigote. It then does the single most audacious thing in its entire life cycle. It starts using your own cell's machinery to multiply. Your cell, hijacked, becomes a parasite factory. It divides again and again inside your own cytoplasm until the cell is so packed with parasites that it physically ruptures, spilling thousands of new invaders into the surrounding tissue to repeat the process in the next cell over. Here's the part that should bother you more than it probably will. Your immune system does eventually notice. It mounts a real response. Antibodies, T cells, inflammation, the whole apparatus, and it's actually pretty effective at clearing the parasite from your blood. The problem is what happens next. Your immune system believes it won, and in a narrow sense it did. Most of the free-floating parasites in your bloodstream get wiped out within weeks. Blood tests during the chronic phase of Chagas disease often show barely detectable parasite levels. Victory lap, right? Except a small population of parasites never left the bloodstream at all. They went to ground, tucked inside heart muscle, nestled in the smooth muscle of your esophagus and colon, quietly persisting in tiny numbers for years, sometimes decades, doing almost nothing detectable. Meanwhile, your immune system, convinced the fight is over, keeps a permanent garrison stationed at the sites of old infection. Chronic, low-grade inflammation, immune cells patrolling tissue that's mostly clear but never entirely clear. And that persistent, simmering inflammation is now considered one of the leading theories for why, 20 or 30 years after the original bite, some patients develop catastrophic heart disease seemingly out of nowhere. Think about that for a second. The parasite doesn't need to win the war. It just needs the peace treaty to be a little bit sloppy. My immune system and I have a complicated relationship. It means well. Results vary. In this case, results vary means possibly your heart 30 years from now. Fast fact. Chagas disease is sometimes called the new AIDS of the Americas by public health researchers. Not because it's transmitted the same way, but because of the eerie structural similarity, a long, symptom-free latent period, followed by organ failure years or decades later in a population that mostly has no idea they're infected. The World Health Organization estimates roughly 6 to 7 million people are currently living with T. cruzi infection, the overwhelming majority of whom don't know it. Chagas disease actually behaves like two completely different illnesses stapled together, separated by years of silence. The acute phase happens in the days and weeks right after infection, and it's often so mild it's mistaken for nothing at all. A low fever, some fatigue, maybe a swollen eyelid if the parasite entered near the eye, a telltale sign doctors call Romagn's sign. Most people never get diagnosed here because most people never feel sick enough to go looking for a diagnosis. This phase almost always resolves on its own, which is exactly the problem because resolves on its own and goes away are not the same thing. Then comes the indeterminate phase. This is the part that should unsettle you. 10 years, 20 years, sometimes the rest of a person's entire life. No symptoms, normal energy, normal heart function on a basic exam. The parasite is there, tucked in muscle tissue, ticking along at a barely detectable pace, and the person has absolutely no reason to suspect anything is wrong. And then, in roughly 30% of cases, the chronic phase arrives.
progressive heart enlargement, disrupted electrical signaling in the heart muscle, causing irregular rhythms that can be fatal. In some cases, the smooth muscle of the esophagus or colon becomes so damaged the organ balloons to many times its normal size, a condition with the almost theatrically ominous name megacolon. Now hold that timeline up next to Darwin's. Infected, hypothetically, in his early 20s on a South American expedition. Mysterious but survivable symptoms, vomiting, fatigue, palpitations, emerging in his 30s and persisting, worsening gradually, for the remaining 40 decades of his life, right up until his death from what his physicians recorded as heart failure. It fits. It fits disturbingly well. It also doesn't fit perfectly, and good medicine requires me to tell you that too. In 1959, a cardiologist named Saul Adler proposed the Chagas hypothesis formally, and it's been debated in medical journals ever since. Some researchers have pointed out that Darwin's earliest symptoms actually began before his time in Chagas endemic regions of South America, which is a real problem for a hypothesis that depends on that specific insect bite as the origin point. Others have raised the fact that severe Chagas cardiomyopathy usually produces a fairly specific pattern on an EKG and specific structural changes in the heart, and we simply don't have Darwin's cardiac imaging, because cardiac imaging as we know it wouldn't exist for another 100 years after his death.
There's also a competing, less romantic explanation that a lot of modern physicians find just as compelling. Cyclical vomiting syndrome combined with a significant anxiety or panic disorder, possibly worsened by the psychological toll of knowing his life's work, a theory that would upend Victorian religious and social order, made him a magnet for criticism he dreaded for decades. Stress doesn't get songs written about it. It doesn't have a cool parasite. But it is an extremely well-documented cause of chronic gastrointestinal symptoms, and Darwin himself, in his own letters, wondered whether his stomach was reacting to his nerves. So here's where honesty matters. We cannot exhume enough certainty from 1882 to close this case. What we have is a plausible, well-argued, genuinely fascinating hypothesis, not a diagnosis. Several respected historians of medicine still find it the most parsimonious explanation. Several others don't. Both camps have read the same 11 pages of that diary and walked away with different conclusions, and that tension is, honestly, kind of the whole appeal of medical history. It refuses to resolve into a tidy ending, the same way most of my actual patients refuse to resolve into a tidy ending. Medicine is just professionally admitting that the past kept better secrets than we'd like. True or false? If Darwin had Chagas disease, doctors of his era could have diagnosed and treated it. Verdict: false. Emphatically false. Trypanosoma cruzi wasn't even discovered until 1909, when a Brazilian physician named Carlos Chagas identified the parasite, its insect vector, and the human disease it causes, an almost unheard of feat in the history of medicine, because Chagas figured out the entire chain of causation essentially by himself, working in a remote outpost in rural Brazil decades before Darwin's illness could have possibly been connected to it. Darwin died in 1882. He was, biologically speaking, unknowingly carrying a disease that hadn't been named yet, treated by doctors who genuinely believed the stomach and the nervous system were locked in some kind of vague sympathetic conflict, which, honestly, given what we now know about the gut-brain axis, wasn't 100% wrong, it just wasn't remotely right either. You're crossing the Argentine pampas on horseback. You've spent the day collecting fossils. You'll later realize some of them belong to extinct giant ground sloths, animals the size of a small car, and you have no idea yet how much that discovery will matter. You're tired. You make camp. You sleep in a mud-walled hut, the kind local travelers use because it's cheap and dry. You don't know that mud-walled huts, with their cracks and thatch, are basically luxury condominiums for Trypanosoma infestans. The insects live in the wall gaps during the day and emerge at night to feed on whatever warm-blooded mammal happens to be sleeping nearby. You are, tonight, that mammal. You feel nothing. You wake up in the morning mildly itchy near your eye, which you attribute to dust or the local flies or nothing at all. You write in your diary, because you write in your diary about literally everything, that a large black bug bit you, and you find it curious enough to describe in detail how it engorged itself with your blood. You go back to collecting beetles. Somewhere inside you, if the hypothesis holds, several thousand single-celled organisms have just begun the process of building permanent real estate in your heart. Fast fact:
The kissing bug's saliva doesn't just numb the bite. Some species contain compounds that also act as local anticoagulants and vasodilators, essentially opening the blood vessel wider and keeping it from clotting shut so the insect can feed efficiently for longer. Evolution independently arrived at blood thinner plus local anesthetic in multiple blood-feeding species, mosquitoes, leeches, vampire bats, and this bug, because it turns out that's simply the most efficient way to rob a mammal without waking it up. Evolution isn't cruel, it's just extremely good at its one job, and its one job has nothing to do with your comfort. Here's something that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. We currently have medications that can cure Chagas disease. Benznidazole and nifurtimox, developed decades ago, are genuinely effective, especially if given during that early acute phase, when they can clear the parasite from the body in a large majority of cases. The drugs are good at stopping a fire, they're much less good at unburning a house. This is one of medicine's oldest, most cruel patterns, and it shows up across a dozen different diseases. The earlier you catch something, the easier it is to treat, and the earliest stage of almost every disease is, by definition, the stage that feels the least worth going to a doctor for.
Known fact, early treatment works well. Known fact, most diagnoses happen late. The paradox? The disease is most curable exactly when nobody thinks they're sick. Not everyone who gets bitten by an infected kissing bug develops severe disease. Roughly 60 to 70% of chronically infected people stay in that indeterminate phase for life. Full lifespan, no cardiac symptoms, no digestive complications, nothing. Researchers still don't fully understand why some immune systems seem to negotiate a stable, permanent truce with the parasite, while others spend decades losing a slow-motion war. Genetics, the specific strain of parasite, the initial dose of infection, and overall immune function are all suspected contributors. This is genuinely unknown territory in the science, and I want to be honest about that rather than inventing a tidy mechanism to make the story feel more complete. Some questions in medicine just don't have a satisfying answer yet. That's not a failure of the field, that's what the actual frontier of research looks like. Chagas disease isn't a relic of 19th century South America. The World Health Organization currently estimates it affects 6 to 7 million people, primarily across Latin America, though migration has meant cases now appear regularly in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan, often diagnosed decades after the person left an endemic region in patients who have long since forgotten, or never even noticed, an insect bite from their childhood. It's classified as one of the WHO's neglected tropical diseases, a category that, brutally, mostly reflects which diseases affect populations with the least political and economic leverage, rather than which diseases are the least dangerous. Chagas disease kills more people annually in the Americas than any other parasitic disease on the continent, including malaria. There is nothing exotic or distant about this. There is just a very good insect and a very patient parasite. Fast fact: modern vector control programs, essentially improving housing so walls don't have cracks the bugs can nest in and using insecticides in high-risk regions, have been enormously successful. Several South American countries have been certified by the WHO as having interrupted domestic transmission entirely in certain regions. It's one of the rare parasitic diseases where basic infrastructure improvements have done more good than almost any pharmaceutical intervention. Sometimes the most sophisticated public health tool in the world is a wall without a crack in it. Darwin died in April 1882, and his death certificate, as much as death certificates from that era can be trusted, points to heart failure, following years of progressively worsening cardiac symptoms. His physicians at the time had no unifying diagnosis. They had a collection of complaints they treated individually, and by most historical accounts, not especially well. If the Chagas hypothesis is correct, then what killed Darwin wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a 40-year-long argument between a parasite that had gone mostly quiet and an immune system that never fully stood down, playing out in the walls of his own cardiac muscle, invisible on any test his doctors had access to, indistinguishable from a dozen other Victorian diagnoses like nervous dyspepsia or suppressed gout that modern medicine has since retired to the historical curiosity bin. If the hypothesis is wrong, and again it might be,
then Darwin simply lived with a severe underlying anxiety or gastrointestinal disorder that, combined with the immense psychological weight of authoring a theory he knew would upend his society, manifested as the physical symptoms that plagued him. Either way, here's what I find genuinely remarkable. This is a man who spent his entire career teaching the world to look for hidden mechanisms behind apparent disorder, behind finchbeaks, behind barnacle anatomy, behind the seemingly random cruelty of natural selection. And his own body may have been running one of the most elegant hidden mechanisms in the history of infectious disease, completely invisible to him for the entirety of his working life. The parasite isn't trying to ruin your day. You're just, unfortunately, made of exactly the nutrients it needs, and it found you the same year you found the Galapagos finches. Neither of you meant anything personally by it. Here's what actually matters if you take one thing from this video. If you've traveled through rural areas of Central or South America, especially if you slept in adobe, mud brick, or thatch-roofed housing, and you notice unexplained swelling around one eye, particularly after an insect bite, that's worth mentioning to a doctor. Not panicking about, mentioning. Romana's sign is rare enough that most doctors outside endemic regions won't think to look for it unless you bring it up. Chagas disease can also be transmitted congenitally from mother to child and through blood transfusion or organ transplant, which is why blood banks in the United States and many other countries now routinely screen for it, even in donors who have never set foot near an endemic region themselves, simply because migration has meant the infection is a global, not regional concern. And if you're chronically infected, the single most useful thing you can do is get a baseline cardiac evaluation, an EKG, an echocardiogram, even with 0 symptoms, because the entire tragedy of this disease is that no symptoms and no disease are not the same sentence. And the earlier a cardiologist can watch for changes, the more tools exist to manage them before they become irreversible.
That's the real lesson buried under the Darwin mystery, and honestly under most of medicine. The scariest diseases usually aren't the ones announcing themselves loudly. They're the quiet ones, the ones that let your own immune system do most of the damage on a decades-long delay, while you go on living an entire life in between. Writing your letters, collecting your fossils, upending your entire field of science with absolutely no idea a small, patient hitchhiker moved in decades ago and simply never left. Darwin spent his life teaching us to look for the invisible mechanisms behind visible outcomes. It would be a strange, quietly poetic irony if the greatest invisible mechanism of his life was operating inside his own chest the entire time, and he never got to know it. We might never know for certain, but now at least you know exactly what we'd be looking for.